All right, so welcome everyone. I'm so thrilled to have Professor Walton Brown-Foster from CCSU back with us. She has provided programs for us in the past, did an excellent program in the past about voter suppression, and is a political science professor at Central Connecticut State University. She's also a coordinating faculty member of the African American Studies program, in which she teaches courses. She is editor-in-chief of the online journal 1619, Journal of African American Studies, and she also serves as the coordinator for the International Studies Latin American Studies program. Her courses in political science also support the African Studies and Peace Studies programs. So Dr. Brown-Foster wears many hats, and we're thrilled that she took the time to be with us tonight. So thank you so much, Dr. Walton Brown-Foster, for being at BPL again.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. So thank you again, Rachel, for the invitation. And thank you, everyone who is in attendance. It is a pleasure to be with you and to share information, pieces of history, and perspective on Juneteenth. Perspective is about Juneteenth. And I am actually flying out to Texas. I'll be in Dallas tomorrow, if all goes well. And so I think it's very befitting that we talk a bit about Juneteenth. And I decided that I would take an intersectional approach in talking about Juneteenth, because as I pondered in preparation for tonight, I thought about the long history of Texas and the current state of affairs that we find ourselves politically. I'm a political scientist, and so my default is always to put the political science lens on everything, even buying groceries, everything, because it's my training. And because the nation, we are in a unique period in history where Texas and Florida in particular share a common history, and both are also sharing a common trajectory when it comes to issues such as African American History Month and the proclivity to repress it or to change it and rewrite it and refocus it. And so as I thought about tonight, I thought it might be useful and perhaps and hopefully um, enlightening to all in attendance to talk about Texas uh, from the perspective of its history and why Juneteenth occurred in Texas and how Juneteenth actually is a part of a long, untaught, unreported history, a much longer trajectory of slavery in Texas that actually began with the Spanish. And so when we talk about Juneteenth, which we all know was the belated announcement about the Emancipation Proclamation for the enslaved in Texas, it was not the first time that you had manumission orders and proclamations and considerations about um, slavery as an institution in the region in general. Uh, and as I said, it began with the Spanish, And overall, we do know that historically the Spanish possessed this region that becomes our Texas first. And then there was a succession, there was a war, there was a long period of tension and transfer of population and efforts to create an independent state initially, and then that morphed into Texas joining the American Union. And I'm sure many of you know about the Alamo and all of that history. And you know it from different perspectives and bits and pieces, but putting it all together in the context of American, the institution of enslavement, but also the Civil War, and then Juneteenth is something that we rarely think about and is a very different approach. So bear with me because this also, I'm sorry, I got distracted. Is that a message, Rachel?
Nope, we're all set. We're just letting everybody know how to put their captions on.
Oh, okay, okay. So I hope you will take this ride with me. It is a very different approach. So there are phases to Texas's history. And by the way, in that long introduction, I think that rarely when people even talk about or think about the Civil War, there are several pieces of information and facts related to Texas in this region of the country that are very important to the Civil War. Um, President Lincoln was, I believe he was as a young congressman, he was the only one to vote against the Mexican-American War. And one of the precursors to the Mexican-American War, which obviously had some impact on the annexation of Texas, was the issue of slavery. And that is a very, and it was a huge issue. It was not a small issue because in the competition for control over this territory, the institution of slavery became a kind of a bargaining chip. Another little known fact about this area of the country and Mexico is that Mexico was a slave state. The region of Veracruz in Mexico imported a significant number of enslaved Africans. And then before that, slavery in what was Mexico. And so you have to envision this period. When I say Mexico, I'm talking about not only the map that you see today, but it is inclusive of Texas and our Southwest and California. And that was Mexico. And the Kingdom of Mexico in the Empire of Mexico. And in its early history, as many of the countries and nations that evolved in Latin America, they were also states that it first enslaved native populations and then transitioned to enslave and import Africans. And so Mexico to this day has a very significant and recognizable population of Afro-Mexican descendants. And also in the relationship between Mexico and the United States and prior to the Civil War and then Juneteenth, there was a huge population transfer of former enslaved African Americans on the American side who moved to Mexico. Mexico was one of those places where, like Florida, where you had the Seminole population and allying with escaped and runaway enslaved Africans in the southeast. Mexico was also, and initially Texas, was also one of those routes where those who were fortunate to escape and find their way would go to Mexico. And then even after the Civil War, you had former enslaved African Americans moving to Mexico, as well as former Confederate soldiers. So it wasn't simply an escape route for former enslaved persons, but also those who fought on the losing side, the Confederacy. They found their way to Mexico and then even further south. And so when we talk about African American history and Texas, we have, like with Florida and lower Georgia, a very unique layer of history that actually begins with the Spanish and continues on. When the slave trade was abolished in the United States by Congress, you did have slave smuggling, kind of like illegal importation, illegal immigration, if you will, in terms of slavery. There were two places, Cuba and Mexico. So the trade continued to English-speaking America even after it had been abolished. And so that's why, with those little tidbits, hopefully you can understand why this approach to discussing Juneteenth from the perspective of what is unique about Texas is so intriguing, because there's a long history of interaction and synthesis between the populations of Mexico and the issue of slavery and American politics and the history of the Civil War, and even the young legislator who actually becomes the first president after the Civil War, President Lincoln. All of this history kind of comes together in very unique ways. Another little tidbit about Mexico and slavery, two things. Some of you may have heard of the famous song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. So can any of you raise your hands? Well, the woman who is the subject of that song actually was a former enslaved African American woman who actually helps prosecute the war with Mexico during the era of Steve Austin and so on and so forth. And then the second president of a newly independent Mexican republic, Herrera, and I will show you pictures, was also the first American, when I say Americas, I'm talking about all the Western Hemisphere. We think in terms of President Obama as being, the first person of African descent becoming the president of a republic in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Not exactly true. And especially when we talk about Mexico, you have their second president, Herrera, who actually was of African descent. And so there are some very unique parallels. And when we put them together, we have a more complete view of history. So that is my introduction. I see there is a hand up, Judy. Judy? There's a Judy with the hand up. maybe she stepped away because it took me a while to get to her. But Judy, when you come back, please don't hesitate to ask your question. So back to the beginning. Slavery in Texas. And so when we'll talk about American slavery or Anglo slavery versus Spanish slavery. And Juneteenth, of course, is relevant to American slavery, which slowly creeps into the region, the territory of Mexico, or of Texas, after Texas is no longer a part of Mexico and becomes a US state in the 1840s. Okay, so when we talk about Mexican or Spanish slavery, that actually begins in the 16th century. And there is a very famous enslaved Spanish man, Estebanico, which is Little Stephen, who actually is credited with discovering Mexico for the Spanish when the Spanish were exploring and conquering this region. He came over, he was enslaved, he was Estebanico, considered the Moor, Estebanico the Moor, which in the 16th century, Moorish, Moreno, brown, Moor actually meant is the equivalent to the nomenclature that we use today, Black or African American. And so it was Estebanico who discovered this territory that eventually the Spanish claimed for themselves. And in Spanish Texas, you did see two phases of slavery. As I said, you had the enslavement of indigenous First Nations populations, primarily Apache, Comanche. And by the way, it's in this region of the Southwest that you also see intermingling between people of African descent and indigenous Americans, not only in the United States, but also in Mexico proper. And this becomes very important, and this is in part one of the reasons that the Black presence in Spanish America and Mexico in particular becomes a little bit obscured. It becomes obscured because of very elaborate terminologies and categorizations of populations. And so you began to see these gradations of identity, which in Anglo-America, it's simply the one drop rule. If you are Black, you are Black. It doesn't matter if you are 1/8, 1/16. If you have Black ancestry, that places you in that category. And certainly at that time, it would mean enslavement. But in Spanish Texas, you had a period of enslavement. And remember, we're talking about Spanish Texas beginning in the 16th century up until the time that Texas becomes American or Anglo-American. And so you have this about 2 centuries in which there are periods of enslavement, but by the 18th century, meaning 1700s, you began to see efforts to move towards emancipation. And this is where economics becomes very important. Enslavement and the institution of slavery becomes critical to the US economy. And this is really the importance of the 1619 project that became so very controversial, because what that project established was the fact that the economic foundations of North America were actually put into place because of the enslavement of Black people and the institution of chattel slavery. We see a different dynamic in Spanish America and Texas, because although the institution was there, and you saw the enslavement of, you saw parallel developments, the enslavement of Native people, and later people imported, kidnapped, those who were human the human trafficking trade, AKA the slave trade. You see it both in Spanish America and English America, but because of different trajectories of economic development in Mexico, there wasn't as much of a reliance on chattel slave enslavement because of a different economic trajectory and economic development patterns. And so the institution became less and less economically viable. And so there, very early on, early on, so now I'm talking about colonial Mexico, including Texas, there was less of a need for chattel slavery, and also chattel slavery as a variant of racial enslavement also took a different route and a different avenue of development because of these very elaborate gradations of identity that resulted from the intermingling of so many people, Europeans and Africans, Africans, Europeans, Native Americans, all combined, as well as the legal institution of marriage, which was allowed in the Spanish system as opposed to the English system. So, any questions so far? So I've taken you from Estebanico in the 16th century to now colonial.
There is a question here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Risa, and I would just like to know I know what the system of American economic growth based on enslavement was. What was the Mexican system?
Well, it's not the Mexican, it's
Spanish.
so the system, so both were are agricultural. I mean, why do you need hands? You need agricultural workers. But what happens largely, and this is very general because there are a lot of, so I'll just speak to Mexico specifically as opposed to all of Latin America, because Brazil becomes a little bit more like the United States. But one of the factors that mitigated against chattel and kind of lifelong slavery in Mexico was a system that the Spanish and eventually the Criollas, those who were Europeans who were, and generations who were born in Mexico, instead of eliminating, and this was also different from the Caribbean too, because in Mexico, Native populations continued to exist and strive, and many maintained control, well, not control of, residency on their traditional lands. I'm trying to simplify, and simplifying, of course, gives short shrift to certain detailed aspects of the system. So instead of, so if you have villages, so you become a plantation owner, which actually means in Mexico, you control like large portions of the land. I mean, like millions and millions and millions of acres of land, as compared to, say, American plantations in which you didn't control like a whole state of Montana or the whole state of Georgia. That becomes possible in Mexico because of a cadillo system. What you see is kind of a feudal system that develops in which families will control large tracts of land. And within those regions, you have indigenous populations and villages. And so a system of labor develops in which plantation owners, landowners, instead of having to import thousands and thousands and thousands of enslaved Africans, or even in continuing to enslave Native people, you have a system in which villages are basically co-opted, and it is a system in which actually this kind of develops in South Africa. South Africa is probably the closest modern parallel that I can give you, in which you have some enslaved, but then for those that remain in the villages, the plantation or owners, the feudal cadillos, would force, say, every 6 months, 3 months, a certain percentage of the male population out of the village to go work in the fields or the mines or whatever economy where labor was needed, and force them to stay away from the villages until the next crop, and then they would go get the second third, and then the third, and they would just recycle in that way, which becomes a little bit more efficient than replacing labor completely with enslaved Africans. Does that make sense? So you have this kind of feudal that develops.
Thank you.
Yes, and so as a result, there's not as much in Mexico of a reliance on the same type of labor system as in English-speaking United States. Any other questions? Is there another question? And for those, so you do see those formerly enslaved Africans and either remaining enslaved or achieving some degree of freedom because they're no longer classified as Black, they're classified as all these other categories. And then you have some who just are freed and remain free and have to make a living the best way that they can. And this is what slowly progresses in Mexico. So any other questions? I'm sorry. By the 19th century, which means the 1800s, Thomas Jefferson does something that affects this region of the country, and it's the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, and so as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, Spain declares that every enslaved person who crossed the Sabine River into Texas would be free. And because with the purchase of the Louisiana property, or the Louisiana purchase properties, all of those, the system changes. You had the French system, and then you had the Spanish system, and then you had the American system because of the Louisiana purchase. So that meant that the American form of slavery changes in Louisiana, and many of those formerly enslaved in the regions of the purchase were lured to flee to Mexico, Texas territories. And a lot of this, we have to understand, is a result of a larger political game in which the expanding new American nation is competing in the region with Mexico and the Spanish and the French empires, because they're all contesting over control of Latin America and the Caribbean and so on. And so enslaved people become pawns. In our history of English-speaking America, you have the same kind of power play that you can understand during the early colonial days, when the French and the British were in competition, and they offered different alliances with different native nations and guarantees. And then during the War of Independence, you had the British lure enslaved American Blacks to side with them and flee to Canada. You have the same kind of dynamic in this region as well, but the players are different. Spain, and then what would become Mexico and the Americans, because we had not yet begun to expand too far west, but things changed radically after the Civil War. So what happens to these African populations who are betwixt and between being Spanish, being in Texas, and the slow American push, English-speaking push towards new territory and conquering the region? Many of them remain free. Some of those who fled from American slavery into Spanish, what would become Texas territory, they are able to maintain their freedom. And some even flee further south into Mexico and further south into Latin America. So you're seeing this very complex system of runaways and freed people of African descent and Native American descent, and so on and so forth. And also you're seeing illegal an illegal slave trade, and the transfer of illegal populations who are enslaved from Mexico and Louisiana up through the Spanish territory that becomes our Texas as well, and New Orleans. We forget that New Orleans and Texas and Mississippi, they're all in the same place. And so you have this kind of very vibrant, lucrative trade in enslaved people and illegal populations as well. So I know that I'm covering a lot, and that's why I want to make sure that I'm not confusing people, that you're discombobulated, but it is a very complex situation, because you have the politics of Spain versus early America, a newly independent country, America, this issue of slavery in the region. You have Spanish forms of slavery. The French get in there a little bit too, but I'll focus largely on Spain and the United States. And then, of course, we're going to have phases of war before the Civil War. There will be um, the Mexican War of Independence that changes things. And in the Spanish region of Texas and the Southwest, the War of Independence against Spain brings with it the promise of freedom for those people enslaved in the Spanish Empire. So after the Mexican independence, you have populations of enslaved formerly enslaved blacks who are free. Now, why is this important? It's important because by the time Anglo-American slavery makes it to what becomes American Texas, you have generations of freed African Americans, some who remain even after the Civil War. Okay, so you have two classes of people. You have people who have ancestry that go way back to the 16th century, who are freed and Black. And then you have populations that fled American slavery after the Louisiana Purchase, who seek freedom there too. And then you have this continuation of illegal trafficking in enslaved African people as well, up from Mexico and Cuba and so on and so forth into the English-speaking colonies, okay? And you have this cauldron and layers of different identities and different statuses of people. So during the 1820s, for example, you had some very famous people like Jean Lafitte. How many of you heard of Jean Lafitte, that term, or that name, Jean Lafitte, for example? He was a great smuggler of illegal and trafficked and enslaved people, kind of like the coyotes that we see happening today on the Texas-Mexican border, coyotes smuggling people who are enslaved. And many of these people go through Galveston, Texas. So Galveston Island, which is far down. And why does that become important? It becomes important because of Juneteenth and so on. At the end of the Mexican War of Independence, you began to see white American populations that are granted access and granted land and granted the right to settle in Texas. And so how many of you have heard of Steve Austin, right? The great founder of Texas. So we're talking about the 1820s, and this is the era of the Yellow Rose of Texas. Well, she comes in later, Emily. But most of the settlers that white American settlers that the Mexican authorities allow. This is after Mexico becomes independent from Spain, after the Mexican War of Independence in the 1820s. You see another phase, another layer of enslavement, because now white Americans and Steve Austin, as he begins to recruit immigrants from Anglo-America, many of those new settlers are coming from the South, and the slave and our own plantation owners or they are opportunists who are seeking their fortune. And one of the fastest ways to a fortune during this period of American history is to own slaves. But now you have new territory opening up where you can bring and purchase, and you can get land. And with that land, you can bring an enslaved person. In fact, Steve Austin offers an immigration program in which a development program in which each settler could bring and purchase an additional 50 acres of land for each enslaved person he or she brought to the territory. So there is not only incentive to immigrate, there's also incentive to bring enslaved persons to the newly freed Mexican territory by Steve Austin in order to attract fortune hunters and attract new English-speaking populations. And this becomes very important because of this deal that Austin offers. There's a larger scheme behind it, because the scheme is to slowly resettle Texas and to change the population ratio from those loyal to the Mexican state to those loyal to the American state, the English American state. And this slowly sets up the population dynamics for Texas's independence from Mexico. And what a crucial part of that scheme was attracting white Americans who owned slaves or wanted to purchase more enslaved African Americans. And they offered very favorable conditions to those persons. But here's where it becomes even more complex, because although Austin was inviting more white plantation owners to bring more enslaved African Americans, there were also incentives for escaped African Americans escaping enslavement to run away to this region as well. So you see two coming from the new Americas, two new populations, enslaved African Americans, and then free Blacks, if you will. In 1820s, and so this cauldron is kind of building up. And so by 1829, Mexico, which still owns Texas, abolishes slavery, right? But that works against the white American Anglo populations that own slaves, right? And so this becomes kind of a precursor to the conflict between America, the United States, and the Mexican government. And the disturbances are precursors to the eventual Texas Revolution and the independence of Mexico. I'm sorry, the independence of Texas. But with the establishment of the Republic of Texas in 1836, the general legal rule was that slavery was legal, and it defined the status of enslaved persons. And even if you were a free Black or free Native person, you were still excluded from the rights and liberties and protections of the new Texas Constitution. Now, I realize I've gone over quite a bit of time, but I set this, so when we talk about Juneteenth in Texas, we're talking about a very complex context in which there are freed Blacks, there are Spanish, pre-American, Anglo-American Black populations. You have newer and older enslaved populations, and you have free people as well. And as you all know, fast forwarding, and this is where we usually begin when talking about Juneteenth, we begin with the Civil War. We know that after Texas becomes an American territory, Texas sides with the Confederacy. You still continue to see that population transfer from the Confederacy to Texas. And Texas becomes the last place that the Union actually conquers. And we know that the Emancipation Proclamation, which was declared 2 years earlier, it didn't reach the people in Texas until 2 years later. And we know that one of the limitations or specifications for the Emancipation Proclamation was that wherever the Union Army was, slavery would be abolished. So it took 2 years for the Union Army to actually reach Texas and declare the Emancipation Proclamation. And by the way, it is kind of a myth that the field order was read. It really wasn't read. It was kind of posted across the city. There was no major declaration. But I want to remind you that you have multiple levels of experience already with emancipation in the region amongst many of the population, as well as different phases of enslavement. So you're talking about a very uniquely different context in which the emancipation occurs. And then finally, I just want to read the field or general order number 3. And it is the order of the Union General Gordon Granger. This didn't come from Congress. It didn't come from the president. It came from General Gordon Granger, June 19th, 1865. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So what does that really mean? That means, okay, you're free, you can work for wages if you can get them, but if you can't get any wages, don't count on us, the military or the American government, to help and to support you. So where does this leave enslaved people in East Texas? And then you start to see Reconstruction impact Texas and roll back some of the federal protections even further. And so Texas, under our country's jurisdiction, throws African Americans, even those who have a long legacy going back to the Spanish. You see Jim Crow eventually, and debt slavery, and so on and so forth, impact their lives as well. So you see this kind of leveling of Black populations, regardless of their histories and regardless of how far their ancestry went. And there you have it in terms of the history and legacy of Juneteenth. In the 1870s, a very stringent system of legalized racial segregation and white supremacy was enforced from our side. So we see the end of Reconstruction, the end of multiracial democracy even developing, come about. You see Jim Crow laws, Texas begins to pass, and another century of the fight for civil rights, but now within the context of the United States of America, and a very different phase of racial relations and the history of African Americans, those African Americans who found their ancestry going back to, say, the Spanish, for example, as I said, are simply leveled, and much of that history is just now being kind of resurrected and rediscovered. And you have a similar process, reclamation when it comes to Florida, but many of those early African populations, Black populations, fled to none other than Cuba. So I will stop there. I hope I didn't meander too long, and hopefully this kind of different perspective adds to your understanding of Juneteenth. And it is and some of the reasons why Juneteenth occurred 2 years later have everything to do with the prosecution of the Civil War and the fact that the Union didn't get to Texas until 2 years later. But the major takeaway that I want you to have is that this whole question of slavery and emancipation was really not, and the whole concept of emancipation and even the possibility of emancipation was not introduced in Texas by or Anglo-America. You had that dynamic back and forth with the succession of ownership of Texas, and as a result of the politics between the Spanish and the English, or the Americans, and then the Mexican government and the American government, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Excuse me, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. John Capadonna. Still 2 years sounds like an awfully long time.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, you're muffled.
Oh, I'm muffled?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. 2 years sounds like an awfully long time for the Army to get into Texas, to liberate it, to defeat it. I mean, could there have been political considerations too?
Well, I'm not a Civil War military expert, but remember, the war was still raging from the time of the Emancipation, and remember the motivation for the Emancipation Proclamation. The hope was that it would encourage Black people to take up arms and fight, because the Union was in some very precarious battles during the time that the announcement was made. And African Americans did, in large part, either leave the plantations, pick up arms, flee to the north, and then, of course, you had the great Massachusetts divisions of free Blacks who became crucial. And it was during this period, Frederick Douglass was a great promoter and of including African Americans in freeing themselves from the American institution of chattel slavery. So, and when was the end of the Civil War declared? It was declared like 1865, which is when the Union Army got to Texas. So it's not called one of the most devastating wars in not only American history, but global history for nothing, because it was a bloody civil war, a bloody civil war. And Texas was on the side of the South.
Wow.
But as far as the logistical battles and all of that, that's not my wheelhouse. I do have a colleague who is an expert on the Civil War, and he'd be happy to take your questions. His name is Dr. Warschauer. So you can reach out to him, but that's not my wheelhouse. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Dr. Brown-Foster, can you comment as a political scientist of what we are seeing with the backlash in the country against teaching race and DEI initiatives? Is there a way to just capture your thoughts on that as a political scientist?
Well, I think that the one thing that is very instructive of the Civil War is the end of Reconstruction, in which you see the same kind of backlash. Promises of greater democracy and inclusion were not immediately, when they became successful, they were pushed back on. And we see the rise of formal legal segregation, a switch in the a retransfer of power back to the states when it came to civil rights and voting rights. And Texas, like Georgia and others, moved to, when we talk about democracy being in the balance, you see the abrogation of voting rights. You see the removal of successful elected African American officials. In the 1890s, a lot of focus is now on Tulsa in the 1920s, but I would take you back to 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, where you had a duly elected African American city government that whites just took over and abrogated the election results. You had the same thing happening in the 1870s in Louisiana, a very similar, very bloody conflict occurring in the 1870s, at the end of the 1870s. And I failed to remember the actual city where you had election results overturned. I discovered that in my family line that one of my ancestors was an elected Georgia representative who is, because in Georgia and many of the other Southeast states, you had very successful elections of Black representatives to state legislatures as well as the US Congress. So there's the Reconstruction Congress, but I discovered when doing some kind of going through family papers that one of my ancestors was actually an elected official. And he was amongst one of the last who had to kind of not run for office again, but actually, I don't know if he went into hiding or what, because he testified against the Klan during the Klan investigations in Washington, D.C., which was very risky business. He was not killed, but I have to do a little bit more digging to find out how did he live his life after that. So this is all to say, Rachel, that we see this kind of slapback, pushback in the post-Reconstruction era. Now, how do you explain it? Well, Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War came about as a result of a fight. So that means that you have winners and losers. And in many instances, if you have very tenacious losers who will go into hiding, I mean, when you think about it, where did they go? Some of the former Confederates did go to Latin America, just as some formerly enslaved Black people flew to Latin America as well. But many stayed, and so adjusted to new political realities. But did they give up on their attitudes and ideas? Obviously not, because we see the rise of Jim Crow. And so when we look at the 1960s, where did the opponents of the Great Society go? Where did the opponents of civil rights go? They didn't go anywhere. They simply stayed by and waited until the tides turned, and so on and so forth. So that's one explanation. There are some, I'm a great reader of, and I do appreciate the analysis of historical analysis of Francis Fukuyama. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with him. He is a Stanford professor who wrote at the end of the Cold War. He wrote a book, The End of History. The Cold War is won, and so history's over. The history of 1945 until the end of the Soviet Union is over. But but as a political scientist, when we studied, and I was teaching during the collapse of the Soviet Union, one question that we asked was, well, what happened to the former, members of the Communist Party? They didn't go anywhere, right? And so we look at one who is now in power, who said apparently that the saddest day and the tragedy of history was the collapse of the Soviet Union, comes back into power, and we're going to resurrect it. So I would simply say that when it comes to ideals of advancement and DEI and values, that it's a constant struggle, and one cannot sleep unless there's a major conversion that happened. We can suspect from the lens of politics and power that losers will run away, come back, and fight another day, and we can anticipate that happening. And so it starts all over again. But I am not a pessimist, and I do believe that the arc of justice and history always gets back on track, and a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I know that sounds so Pollyannish, but I have been accused of being a Pollyanna. But there's nothing wrong with being a Pollyanna. So, but if that's the side that one is on, then one recognizes that it's just another what is it? History doesn't repeat itself. It does rhyme. And so here we go, but it's kind of a little bit. And then finally, some suggest that we see this kind of back and forth, 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, kind of pendulum battle because of economics, and also because although the ideals are not, so we can't just simply conclude that the ideals are being rejected by those who are against certain things. But there might be some other factors, like maybe it's happening all too fast. And there are some people who just can't adjust to change. It becomes scary. And then quite simply power. I mean, who gives up power? Just kind of voluntarily. Who gives up privilege voluntarily? Who gives up being special voluntarily? And so you have to take those into account. As far as African American history, it's unfortunate that it is politicized the way that it is, because there's nothing political about it and there's nothing fictitious about it. It's simply facts. And you can either have this is my real, you can either have the fiction of a kind of dumbed down, kind of washed out history fiction, or you can have the real facts that really point to some of the root causes, and that will help us to actually work our way out of it. But as my stepmother told me, she said, what do you want? Fiction? Do you want or do you want facts? They both start with F, right? So I think that's the struggle that we are in now when it comes to history. And I know I said one last thing, but here's the real one last thing. When it comes to issues of race, I think that the worst thing that has happened is the expropriation of the term colorblind society. It was taken out of context, and it's really, when you think on a very practical level, what does that mean? The meaning was, and the goal was, to make it not count when it comes to certain things. But it didn't mean, in my opinion, necessarily that some of the institutional and societal and structural mechanisms that factored in to the great inequalities that we have in society, it didn't mean that, to me, that it was inappropriate to use as part of the cure the problem. So I look at this scientifically. When we look at vaccines, all vaccines that are meant to prevent disease have a bit of the disease that it's meant to correct. And so this kind of fiction that, in order to get to where we want to, we can't use any of the causes to begin with to cure it, is just not scientifically, and plus it's not realistic in my opinion. So that's my story. I guess I'm on record because it's being recorded, right? Oh boy.
Any other
But I would,
questions?
I say this in my classes all the time, so.
Yeah.
Oh,
thank-
that's a problem too, no.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Did anyone have another question?
Well, I do hope that, I know I didn't, which would, it would normally, when talking about Juneteenth, the traditional course of action would be just to talk about, to start right there, with Juneteenth, and what happened and how it happened and so on and so forth. And so I really do appreciate your patience with me taking a totally different tact and starting to talk about the context of Texas, in which all of this happened. And I hope you see some of the themes, especially when we talk about population transfer and trafficking, and you still see the same issues coming up, or in that same area, region of the country. It just didn't happen. Somebody's trying to get in.
We have a thank you. Historical context is critical and has not been taught. So thank you for educating us tonight. As you said early on in the call before everybody came in, any of the typical Juneteenth story can be looked up, but what we didn't have, I'm certain, is what you offered us tonight. So I do appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Wish me luck in Texas.
I was just going to
Well,
say, yes, safe travels and good luck tomorrow, and happy Juneteenth, everyone. Thank you
Happy
for
Juneteenth.
spending the evening with us tonight.
Thank you.